song will be number 540, 540. I'd like to mark the books, number 753, being song of invitation. I'll wait for the devotion. Oh, for a faith that will not shrink, oh, press for every foe, that will not tremble on the brink of any earthly woe, that will not murmur or complain beneath the chasing rod. Oh, in the hour of grief or pain, will lean upon His star. Of faith that shines more bright and clear when tempest rage without, and when in danger those who fear in darkness feels no doubt. Forgive us such a faith as this, and then whatever may come, we'll tasting here the hallowed bliss of an eternal home.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you here to church services, New Boston Church of Christ, midweek Bible study. I know we have visitors tonight. We're glad to have them. I hope they like it enough to come back again. Working out in the depot, so I guess they're going to be around for a few weeks. Everything's pretty much the same as it was except for a couple of items. Ladies' Day at Highland. Church of Christ Saturday, band leads at 10 o'clock. That's this Saturday. Gospel meeting, pamphlets are in the foyer for our gospel meeting coming up October 6th, I believe, through the 9th. The wedding announcement still from Morgan Hope and Mason Thomas, and that is on October the 5th. Is that right? 6 o'clock. Okay, and let's see. Ladies, check for dishes in the back from all the funerals. Did I miss anything else? Okay, we need to bring up all the things. Let's all go to our Heavenly Father in prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you for this time that you've given us. Never let us take it for granted. That we know that this is a great blessing from you, that you give us here to be able to come worship together without any interference from any outside forces. Provided for us to worship you. Let us put all the worldly matters to our minds so we can concentrate on your word, study your word at this time. Lord, please be with the ones that's lost loved ones. Wrap your loving arms around them, as we know you can through prayer. Comfort them. Help us to pray when we pray for the ones that's lost loved ones. Help fill that void there and help them to go on with each and every day. Be with our elders here and help us to help them in every endeavor that we undertake. Help us all to love, encourage one another. In Christ's name we pray.
In our study of the book of Job, we are getting to the part where God speaks directly to Job. And the first thing that God says to Job is in chapter 38 and verse 1, 2, and 3. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Now that is a different state of affairs than what Job was expecting to happen. In fact, all throughout Job's speeches in the first part of the book of Job, Job has been saying, if I only had an audience with God, I would ask Him why all of these shows up and gives Job an audience, it's not Job who gets to ask the questions, but God who asks the questions of Job. You know, so many times in our lives we think that maybe, if only I had this question answered, maybe God would answer this question for me. And while that seems to be an innocent thought to us, the reality of the matter is it's not our place to ask questions of God, it's God's place to ask questions of us. And we should be willing to answer those questions that God has for us. Many of those questions He has placed within the Bible. And many commands He has placed within the Bible as well for us to respond to. And it is, like Job, our responsibility to respond to God, not expect Him to respond to us. In Acts chapter 17, Paul was with the various different philosophers in the city of Athens. And they had so many questions, for Paul about the things that he had been saying there. But at the end of Paul's speech, he says these words, "The times of ignorance God once winked at, but now He commands all men everywhere to repent, inasmuch as He has appointed a day in which He will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom He has ordained, having given assurance unto all men in that He has raised Him from the dead." Today, God has raised Jesus Christ from the dead to give us assurance, to answer our questions about what He expects. And in doing that, He now expects something from us. That is, to respond to the will of His Son, Jesus the Christ. How do we do that today? By hearing the Word of God and believing it, repenting of our sins, confessing Him as Lord, and being baptized for the forgiveness of sins. That is how we get into a right relationship with God. And then in that blessed relationship, we are privileged to be able to speak to God in prayer. In fact, being a Christian has tremendous blessing in that regard, because we are counted as brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ, God's own Son. And as a result, we have the same access to the Father that Jesus Christ has. He sits at the right hand of the throne of the Father and ever lives to make intercession for us. What a blessing it is then to be a Christian and to be able to approach God's throne in prayer and have all of our thoughts and concerns represented before the Father by Jesus Christ. Maybe you need to have that representation within your life. John writes in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 1, "Beloved, we write these things to you that you sin not. But if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous." Why not take advantage of Jesus as an advocate this very hour by obeying His clear and simple plan of salvation? Or maybe you need the prayers of the church this evening to help you with some difficulty or problem that you're going through. Many use this time to ask for those prayers. If that's your need tonight, then we'll be happy to pray with you and for you. Whatever your need may be, now is an opportunity to make it known. You can come forward and make it known while together we stand and sing the song of encouragement.
We're all made to wonder why it should be us all the day long. While there are others singing around us, never molested, knowing the wrong. Are there alone will know about it? Are there alone?
heaven, we thank you, Father, for the many blessings you give us. We thank you, Father, for being our Father and our Lord. We thank you for being true to us. We pray, Father, that as we continue to do your will, that we can be true to you. Help us, Father, as we continue to study your word. Help us to understand those things that we need to understand so that we can reach that goal. Be with us now as we separate in our classes. Be with our teachers. Be with our students. Forgive us of our sins, we pray through Christ. Okay, well, last week we were looking at the second half of Elihu's monologue, and that is in Job chapters 35 through 37. So if you have your Bibles with you, you might just open to those chapters, Job chapter 35 through 37. I believe that we got through most of 37, but let's just go ahead and review the last couple of chapters here in Elihu's speech. And in essence, what Elihu is doing is he seems to be describing a coming storm. And he talks about how God works through this storm. And there's discussion of the clouds in chapter 36 and verse 28. And then the thunder in chapter 37 to verse 5. And lightning as well is coming. The storm makes it so that beasts go into their dens and remain in their lairs. Chapter 37, verse 8. And the whirlwind comes, chapter 37, verse 9. And that whirlwind is going to be, in essence, the whirlwind that he's talking about there. It's going to come right to where they're at. And that's God's going to speak out of this whirlwind to Job and his friends here, and that's chapter 38, verse 1. And so he continues to describe this storm in the rest of chapter 37. But then notice that in chapter 37, verse 19, after praising God for his magnificence, Elihu asks this question. He says, "Teach us what we should say to him, for we can prepare nothing because of the darkness." In other words, what Elihu is basically saying is this: compared to God, our knowledge is minuscule. It's just nothing, and we really don't have a place to ask of God in the sense that Job has been asking of God, to demand this sort of tribunal or this situation, this court appearance that Job wants with God, so that he can cross-examine God, so to speak, and find answers to his questions. Well, God's not going to play that game, right? He's not going to say, "Job, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll step in here and just let you do whatever you want." No, that's not the kind of God he is. How many of y'all seen the movie, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or maybe read the book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Anybody? Okay, back here, over here, a couple of people, one over here. All right. Well, it's an interesting book, an interesting movie, but in that book, somewhere in the series, I think, I don't know if it's in the first book or not, but the author says that, and there's a character in the book that represents Jesus, more or less, as God. All right, and the character's name is Aslan, and he's a lion. All right, and so one of the things that's said about him is that he's not a tame lion. All right, and that's a significant point that the author is trying to make about God. God is not tame. He doesn't, he's not like a pet that you can come and you can stroke when it's convenient for you and then send away when you don't want him anymore. God does not act like that. That's not who he is. He is not subject to our discrepancies. He is the one who is in control of all things, and he is the ruler. And that's the attitude that we need to have toward God. Not like he is some kind of a pet or some kind of a tame animal that we can go in and visit with at our leisure, and then go and leave him there knowing that he's not going to act out at us. No, that's not who God is. And in that regard, that's kind of how Job has been treating God here, and God's about to give Job a lesson about that. But Elihu asks the question, tell us what we should say to him. Teach us what we should say. God already knows everything that there is to know, and there's nothing that Job is going to bring to God's attention that's going to change anything that has been already happening. And so, Job, why would you even want this audience with God if God already knows everything that's going on and nothing's going to change? Why would you even ask for that? And the only answer that Job would be able to give in that regard is to satisfy me, right? And of course, that's not how God operates. He doesn't operate to satisfy us. We are in the business of seeking to satisfy him and to please him, not the other way around. So many today have that backwards. They think that God is someone who is there to make them happy and to please them and satisfy them. And that is not the situation at all. And I'm afraid, unfortunately and sadly, that many people are going to be disappointed when it comes to Judgment Day because of what their expectations are of God. And God is not going to be there to meet their expectations. And why is that? Because that's not who God is. God isn't there to please us. We should be here to please him. All right. So Elihu says, teach us what we should say to him. This is verse 19 of chapter 37. For we can prepare nothing because of the darkness. Should he be told that I wish to speak, if a man were to speak, surely he would be swallowed up. Even now, men cannot look at the light when it is bright in the skies, when the wind has passed and cleared them. He comes from the north as golden splendor. Well, let's stop right there. So in verse 21, what Elihu is basically saying, look, as a human being, you can't even go outside and stare at the sun for a long period of time and expect to come away undamaged by that, or just to lay out in the sun and expect to come away undamaged by that. The sun will destroy you if you expose yourself in that way. Well, God is so much more powerful, than that. How would you expect to appear before God and not expect to be damaged somewhat by his presence, since he's so much greater even than our sun that we have that comes around the earth, And that's kind of what Elihu's argument is. He's right about that. So, but now, verse 22, he comes from the north as golden splendor, with God as awesome majesty. As for the Almighty, we cannot find him. He is excellent in power and judgment and abundant justice. He does not oppress. Therefore men fear him. He shows no partiality to any, who are wise of heart. And his representation of God, at least in those verses, is correct. Anyone have any questions about Elihu and what he has discussed here? All right, well, let's move on. I do want to let you know that I'm planning on dismissing class just a little bit early tonight. There is a community, this is homecoming week, and there's a community event over at the pavilion that I think several of our people would like to go to. So we're going to dismiss a little bit early, not too early, but enough to give everybody time to get over there who wants to go. And anyway, but we'll go ahead and keep going until that point. But just to give you a heads up so you won't be surprised when we quit, well, why are we quitting early, that kind of thing. So, okay. Here we go, chapter 38. Everybody should have a handout. God requires answers of Job regarding the workings of the natural world. And all the questions in chapter 38 seem to be about the natural world. Chapter 39 is going to be God requiring answers, or chapter 38 verse 39 through 39 verse 30 is God requiring answers about the behavior of animals. All right, and so there's different lines of questions that God asks of Job in these chapters, and of course the point that God is making over and over again is ultimately found in chapter 40 and verse 14, verses 13 and 14. Now let's just skip ahead a little bit so we'll kind of understand what's going on here. God is going to ask Job in verse 8 of chapter 40, would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? And then he says, when you can answer these questions, verse 14, then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can save you. All right? And so, in essence, what God is accusing Job of doing is elevating himself to the point where he is seeking to justify himself as opposed to justify God. And in that regard, Elihu also mentioned that point. And Elihu was correct about that Job was trying to justify himself instead of justify God. And so God, in essence, by asking Job all these questions, is saying, look, if you can't even answer these questions, then how do you think you could justify yourself? And the answer is, Job's answer is, I cannot. I'm just not going to talk anymore, because if I do, I'm just going to dig the hole deeper, more or less. And so Job just doesn't talk. And he lets God continue as long as God wants to continue. But ultimately, in the end, because Job did demonstrate faith in God, God then lifts Job up and really does use him then to mediate on behalf of his friends, who he says did not speak things that were right concerning him. So, all right, so let's look at chapter 38. Now, many of these questions are kind of scientific type questions, and many of them have not been even answered by science yet. Now, some science today has answered some of these questions, but not all of them. And we're not going to get into the science or anything for all these. We could go on for a long, long time talking about science and many of these questions. So we're not going to get into that. But we're just going to look at it, look at these questions, and then talk a little bit about them. But notice what we have here. Chapter 38, verse 1. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. So we've already discussed both of these points that God makes. That number one, Job was speaking by words without knowledge. Elihu also accused Job of doing that. And it seems like Elihu's evaluation was correct, since God here says that Job is speaking by words without knowledge also. Then the second point, which we talked about in our devotional time, is this idea that God is the one who asks the questions, not Job. And that's what we need to be respectful of. When it comes to God, it's not our place to question God. It's our place to let Him ask the questions and answer them appropriately according to His will, so that we can live our lives in peace with God. And that's what we want to do. Okay, so God starts asking these questions. Verse 4. Here they are. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. That's a pretty tough one, to begin with. Of course, Job wasn't in existence yet. And that had to be a pretty big blow to his personal pride there, his ego a little bit. But, God starts off with just saying it like it is. And again, last week we discussed a little bit about how many of us would give Job a break, because Job has been suffering, and he's lost his family members, and he's lost his possessions, and he's had all these horrible experiences, and we'd probably look at him and say, "Well, I feel sorry for you, Job. It seems like you got a rough deal here, And but God doesn't even do that to Job. He starts right off with one of the most difficult questions that he can ask of him. And why is that? Because, as Elihu mentioned earlier in one of his speeches, he said that Job had chosen iniquity instead of suffering. And in essence, Elihu's right about that. Even in the midst of the deepest, most darkest suffering we could experience, we still do not have a right to lift ourselves up with pride and make accusations against God. And so in that regard, Job, in expecting God to answer him, has left his place as a created being and made himself equal with God in that regard. And he doesn't have a right to do that. And so that's in essence what God is saying here. Job, you are not equal to me. You don't have the right to question me. And you were not at the beginning of the world. You were not there when I laid the foundations of the world. And so, since you weren't, then you just need to hush up here and let me manage things in the way that I see fit to manage them. Because, guess what, Job? Even though you may not believe it right now, and I'm speaking, with God here, God is saying to Job, I do know what I'm doing, right? A lot of times I think that's probably how we come across as well when we doubt God or question God or challenge God in whatever way. God does know what He's doing, and our place is to put our faith and trust in Him and to let Him take care of things. Well, he's going to go on and continue to ask questions, but God doesn't give Job a break. And that's because God does not excuse sin. Now, God will forgive sin, but that means that we have to confess and acknowledge our sin for God to forgive us. But God does not excuse sin. He doesn't brush it off. He doesn't take it lightly. He deals with it directly. And He always expects people to act responsibly in regard to what He tells them. Regardless of what their situation is, regardless of how much they're suffering or how much stress they're under or how many problems they have in their life. God does not excuse sin. And we never have a right to commit sin to alleviate our suffering or to use it as some kind of way to excuse ourselves from not taking responsibility. All right. Verse 5, who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Some of these things are a little sarcastic here, that God is talking to Job in that way. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Notice God has, so there's questions about the creation of the earth. Verses 8 through 11, he has questions about the oceans. Who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, when I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors, when I said, this far you may come, but no farther, and here your proud waves must stop. You know, there is a limit to the oceans on the earth. As how far they come, we call that sea level, right? And that level is more or less consistent. I don't think it's changed very much over the years. Perhaps it's changed a little bit, risen a little bit, fallen a little bit here and there. I don't know, but you know, the changes have not been drastic or anything like that. So God controls all that, and He knows how to manage those things, and He does a good job of managing it. And I'm content to let Him manage it. And that's what Job needs to be content to do as well. God can manage the oceans and the clouds and all the water that circulates in the world, then surely He can manage our life, right? And the things that we undergo. Verse 12, have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place? Here's some questions about light and the sun and things like that. That it might take hold of the ends of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it. It takes on form like clay under a seal, and stands out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and the upraised arm is broken. And so, questions about why light dispels darkness here in verses 12 through 15. And that's a pretty deep question when you think about it. Why does light dispel darkness? I don't know if I know. I don't think I know the answer to that. I just know that light works. You know, you flip the switch and you get it. But how it is that it does what it does and interacts with the eyes and all that, I don't know a lot about that. Maybe some people do, but it's not me. And that's a tremendously profound question to ask in that regard. Verses 16 through 18, what is the measurement of the earth? Have you entered the springs of the sea, or have you walked in search of the depths? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen doors of the shadow of death? Have you comprehended the breadth of the earth? Tell me if you know all of this. So the springs of the sea, that's an interesting statement. There actually are springs in the oceans and in the seas. In fact, there was an elder of the church in Berryville, Arkansas, and he told me this story. And any who's been in the Navy, I don't know, maybe you know this, I don't know. I've never experienced it, but this is a story he told me, and I believe it. He said that when he was in the Navy, and he was in the Navy in the Second World War, that there were places in the middle of the ocean that they could sail to, and they could let down their buckets, and they would bring up fresh water, because there was such a big spring of fresh water in that location. Now, I don't know that myself personally. I did not experience that, but he did. And he said that's what we did. We'd go to these places, we'd let down our buckets, and we'd pull up fresh water. And, you know, that I don't guess that's too hard to believe, because Lewis and Clark had their expedition, and they were at the mouth of the, what's that river called up there, Portland, Oregon? The river, the Columbia, yes, it's the Columbia, thank you. They were at the mouth of the Columbia River. There was so much fresh water coming out of the mouth of the Columbia River, they had to go they sent somebody to collect salt from the seawater, and he had to go 25 miles away from the mouth of the Columbia River to get seawater that was salty enough that you could distill salt from it. And he didn't return for several days, and they sent somebody after him and said, well, I tried it here, it didn't work. I tried it there, it didn't work. I had to go way over here. And that was because of the large amount of fresh water that was coming out of the Columbia River. So, you know, if that's possible, then I suppose it's possible that there's some spring out there somewhere where there's a tremendous amount of fresh water coming out of the earth. I know that there's a spring in Arkansas called Mammoth Springs. Anybody been to Mammoth Springs? You have? Yeah, and I've been there. And that spring starts a river. It's Spring River. And it's big. There's, I don't know how many millions of gallons of water that flow out of Mammoth Springs there. And it's a tremendous source of fresh water. And so the springs of the sea. Or have you walked in search of the depths? Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Or have you seen the doors of the shadow of death? Of course, death is a great mystery to all who are living, but it's not a mystery to God. He knows all about it, and He knows what happens, and He's in control of that whole process as well. Have you comprehended the breadth of the earth? Well, in Job's day, they hadn't, but in our day, we know the answer to that question. It's about 25,000 miles in circumference at the equator, I believe. And so it may be a little bit less than that, I don't know, but that's a pretty good size anyway. But Job did not know that. All right, verses 19 through 21, what are the origins of light and darkness? Where is the way to the dwelling of light? And darkness, where is its place, that you may take it to its territory, that you may know the paths to its home? Do you know it because you were born then, or because the number of your days is great? Now, I'm not sure if God is speaking about the origin of light. You know, when He said in Genesis 1:1, let there be light, and there was light. Or if God is just speaking of the process of light creation. You know, even that is somewhat of a mystery to us. I remember when I was in when I was in college studying astronomy, that we talked about the nuclear fusion that takes place in the sun. And we said, well, when this atom collides with this atom, you know, they fuse together, and it emits a photon. You know, and I'm like, well, where did that come from? I'm like, I have no idea. It just happens, you know, it just emits a photon. Well, was it there beforehand, or did it get made when they collided? I don't know the answer to that question. Scott, do you know, or you do? Where does it come from?
You want me to explain it?
No, not really. Can you do it in a sentence?
No.
Okay, never mind then. You can tell me later. But, you know, I mean, it just comes. That's what they taught us. And so, okay, and there's, you know, I don't know how many trillions and trillions and trillions of photons that the sun releases. It's an astronomical number, you know. But there's ways that light can be generated. And God knows how to do all that. He put the structures in place for it to happen. And to me, that's an incredible thing. So, but Job didn't know any of that, of course. Look at verse 22 to 24. Have you entered the treasury of snow? Or have you seen the treasury of hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? Or by what way is light diffused, or the east and wind scattered over the earth? Snow and hail are pictured here as having a treasure within them. And they do. Snow and hail bring things to the earth that rain does not bring. They bring nitrogen and some other different things that they absorb from the atmosphere. And then when snow and hail falls, it gives the earth some additional minerals that are not present just from rain, from what I understand. And so that's very good for the earth. The treasure of snow and hail here, though, it seems to be compared to battle and war, which indicates the idea that God can intervene in warfare by sending snow or hail, and thus making the conditions of the battle change in such a way so that that battle will come out the way that God wants it to come out. And that may be something that's being contemplated here. But of course, Job didn't have such power to do that. Let's go ahead and ring the first bell, all right? So provided a channel for the overflowing water, or a path for the thunderbolt, to cause it to rain on a land where there is no one, a wilderness in which there is no man, to satisfy the desolate waste, to cause to spring forth the growth of tender grass. Has the rain a father, or who has begotten the drops of dew, from whose womb comes the ice and the frost of heaven, who gives it birth? So these are questions about water and the various forms of water. You have water as a liquid form, and there's the channel for the overflowing water. There is water in the form of a mist or gas, and then you have frozen water. That is also one of the forms of water. That's an amazing thing in and of itself, that water is so versatile and is so useful in all of its various different forms. Of course, God made it that way so that it would be versatile and useful to us for our lives, to support our lives and to support life on the earth and all the life that's here on the earth. Would I have come up with a plan like that? I wouldn't even been able to begin how to plan something like that, But God knows how to do that, and that's an amazing thing. So, and that can provide for all these different areas. The water is hardened like stone, and the surface of the deep is frozen. And this is an interesting thing as well. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Scott's our local scientist here, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe water is the only element that when it freezes, it floats.
Yes, but it's not an element.
That's right. It's not an element. It's a
Yeah. Yes, sir. It's the only molecule that
molecule.
becomes less dense when it.
But that in and of itself is a tremendous design, because what would happen if water sunk? When it froze, if it sunk like all the other molecules that get hard, well, fish would all die. All the life in the ocean would die, and all the plant life would die. Well, that would be a horrible situation. All life on earth would be destroyed. But here, water, when it gets hard, it doesn't sink, it floats. And that's really good. That's a really good thing. And even though that sounds like something pretty simple, it's really amazing. And so, All right, verse 31. Can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades? We're going to try to finish out the chapter here. Bind the cluster of the Pleiades, or loose the belt of Orion. This is the constellations that he's referring to. Can you bring out Mazzaroth in its season? That's another constellation. Can you guide the great bear with its cubs? That's another constellation. Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you set their dominion over the earth? The ordinances of the heavens are quite complex and vast. It wouldn't even be a Bible class if we started to discuss that, because there's so much science involved in that. But there are laws that govern the earth, that govern the heavens, and those laws are fixed. They're unchangeable. And if they were to change, the universe as we know it would cease to exist. And that's just the way it is. God set those laws up. Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that an abundance of water may cover you? Can you send out lightnings, that they may go and say to you, here we are. Who has put wisdom in the mind, and who has given understanding to the heart? And of course, that's the heart of the matter here, is that God is the one who has all wisdom and knowledge. Who can number the clouds by wisdom, or who can pour out the bottles of heaven when the dust hardens in clumps and the clods cling together? Can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions? Well, we'll stop right there, and we'll pick up with verse 39 next week. But these questions that Job asked God are questions about wisdom and knowledge, and Job doesn't have the answers, but God does, and that's why Job just needs to trust God to take care of him, because he's done so all over. All right, well, we'll stop there for tonight, and you those who want to go to the pep rally and the time. Thank you so much for coming.